and gentlemen, time for your attention please. Just a couple of parish notices before we start. Saturday 8th of February we have the Society of Salome's Carnival Ball. The 15th of February we have the Candlelight Club Valentine Ball. Sheridan Children's Weekend at the Beach is 16th to the 18th of May, Walton-on-the-Naze, Essex. So, our annual Punt and Plunge in Oxford is towards the end of April. There's actually a poll on Facebook at the moment to choose the date. The latest issue of Resign is on the presses at the moment and is being posted to subscribers. If you want to subscribe, there are details on our website. Luca has brought along some goodies over on the windowsill, so anybody wants to have a look at those. Not sure what next month's talk is.
We don't have one yet.
Don't have one yet.
We have one for April, so if anyone fancies doing a talk next month, you? Yay! Do you want to say something about this place?
Just stick some Nazis in it, I love that.
Yeah.
That gives explanation.
Yes, the landlord of the pub has told us that the pub is being refurbished from April. This room is being kept; it's not being turned into flats as was the original. But we're not sure if it's going to be a dining room or if it's going to be a function room that can be booked. So
it's new owners, so basically it's new rules.
Yeah.
So next time it's going to be a disco, yeah?
Yes.
Amazing.
So that means
we're re-nosing the new Sheridan Club.
Yeah. So from April we'll have to find new premises temporarily or permanently, but obviously we'll keep you informed. But if anybody does know any pubs that have free function rooms in central London, please let the glorious committee know. And now for tonight's talk. Last month we had murder, which brought in the crowds, and this month we have obscenity. So we do know our membership very well.
Everybody likes dirty pictures.
Everybody likes dirty pictures. So Ed Marlowe will talk about the Obscene Publications 1959. Thank you, Ed.
I have been asked what the PRW is. It's a reference to my residence in the People's Republic of Whitechapel, in case anybody wants to know. However, ladies and gentlemen, this evening, in the words of the immortal Charles Gray, I would like, if I may, to take you... That was rhetorical. To take you on a strange journey, specifically the journey of how I learned to stop worrying and love the Obscene Publications Act 1959. Alternatively, we could call it No Sex Please, We're British. What's going on there? Oh. Sorry, ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid the PowerPoint appears to have been infected with my internal monologue. Sorry about that.
Ed, I know you're into shadow casting, but just be aware.
Oh, thank you. For the benefit of anybody who missed that. Anyway, so the Obscene Publications Act 1959. But first, the prologue. I'm so glad there are other people old enough to get that joke. Now, where were we? So, the print press. So, way back before we had movable type, it was very difficult to produce a book. You had to phone. Well, I was going to say you had to phone up a monk. You didn't phone the monk. You had to contact a monk and have them draw you a book, and you'd phone him up. You'd contact him, you'd write him a letter. After a year or so, you'd say, "How's my book coming on? I'm very much looking forward to read it." And he would come back to you and say, well, I've done the first word. What do you mean the first word? Well, I've done the in from the in the beginning, but the I looks lovely. I've done a lot of work illuminating that. It was all done by hand. Books were very long and very expensive and hard to get at, but only rich people could read anyway, so, swings and roundabouts. However, we got the print press. Now, printing, of course, goes way back. This is the oldest known surviving commercial advertisement in the world, and it is from the Liu family needle shop during the Song dynasty in China, 960 to 1270 AD. And if my ancient Mandarin isn't too rusty, there's a rabbit there, so presumably someone was Year of the Rabbit. It's now Year of the Snake. So if any of you have kids this year, fair warning, they'll grow up and become estate agents. But this says, we make fine steel needles while you wait for you to use in sewing at home. So this was a carved plate that would be used to print pieces in the same way as the cavemen in Western Europe at the time used their fingers on a wall. Now, then, of course, in Europe, although, of course, South Korea and the Far East predated us, but we didn't know that at the time, Johannes Gutenberg creates this lovely thing, and movable type arrives in Europe. Caxton brings it to England in 1476, and early on we get the Bible. Gutenberg publishes the Bible first, then he publishes a work of pornographic etchings. Of the two, over time, it's the Bible that turns out to be rather more controversial, publishing in English, but there we go. Now then, of course, over time it all gets very complicated and lots of regulation, but this is where the mass media starts. And but for this, we wouldn't really have the idea of obscene publications in the same way as we do now. The first Obscene Publications Act, historically, 1857. So there were various royal proclamations, and Henry VIII in 1529 created the first list of naughty books. That's got an E on the end of it. Henry VIII, Britain's, I will have you know, Britain's most popular historical monarch, according to the readers of Majesty magazine in a poll in 2012. Lots of fans of religious intolerance out there. I grew up amongst many of them. And eventually, by various acts and so on, there were prohibitions that applied to bad books and naughty things. There were. In 1787, George III issued the Royal Proclamation for the Discouragement of Vice. But it was very difficult under these, or even the Vagrancy Act in 1824, to actually prosecute somebody who was publishing and producing the works. This all changes in 1857, when for the first time it becomes a legal offence, a crime, to publish obscene material. The courts then, under this act, are granted the power to seize and destroy offending material. Those censorious Victorians, or so we are led to believe. Now, actually, when this bill was presented in Parliament, there was quite a lot of freedom of expression-based opposition, and the Houses eventually allowed it to pass. It was Lord Campbell here who actually introduced it. But eventually the Houses allowed it to pass on the understanding that it was intended only to apply exclusively to works written for the single purpose of corrupting the morals of youth and of a nature calculated to shock the common feelings of decency in any well-regulated mind. Present company here very much excluded, I feel. Now, the Act, as I said, provided for the search and seizure of obscene materials. But obscene material was not defined. This is where we introduce our old friend, what we call interstitial common law. As I'm sure we're all aware, common law is law made by the courts rather than decreed by the legislature. Interstitial common law is precedent which is laid down by the courts, which interprets the statute in the absence of clarity. So we get to the 1868 case of the Crown against Hickling. Lord Justice Coburn here, who succeeded Campbell in 1859, he presided over the case. And this involved a guy called Henry Scott, who was reselling copies of an anti-Catholic pamphlet entitled The Confessional Unmasked shewing the depravity of the Roman priesthood, the iniquity of the confessional, and the questions put to females in confession. So this is being sold now. When the pamphlets were ordered to be destroyed as obscene, it gets appealed. And the appeal is to the effect that, well, you know, these aren't obscene. It's not clear what obscenity is. You know, this is wrong and unfair. So it ends up in the Court of Appeal. And in the Court of Appeal, it's Coburn who comes up with this idea. We get this first definition of obscenity in English law. This becomes the classic test of what is obscene. Does the material have a tendency to deprave and corrupt those whose minds are open to such immoral influences, and into whose hands a publication of the sort may fall? And this is the classic definition of obscenity, slightly tweaked, as we'll see, but this is how we've understood obscene material.
And that's what that guy said.
That's what he said.
Look at him.
Look at him in his
Well, he likes to drink.
lovely beer. He clearly likes to drink, and who knows
And he
what's
wears a
going
dress.
on there. Yeah, my kind of guy.
Pronounce his name.
Now, the melon farmers, of course, groups like them are one of the more prominent groups who oppose this legislation. All sorts of edgelords who say, oh, we shouldn't have any control over what we see. It's very common, it's very popular, as opposed to say, oh no, we can't have any censorship. Censorship is all evil and wrong. And then you say to the same people, so kiddie porn, cool. Generally speaking, they're not so keen. So, you know, we all, by and large, I think, draw a line somewhere between what is and isn't acceptable. The melon farmers, incidentally, on their side of the line, opposing all of this, got that name from Repo Man. Anybody seen it? The Alex Cox movie? It's a great film. And they were doing an edit for television. He was asked to prepare a version that could be shown on American network television when you couldn't have rude words like motherfucker. And being deprived of a classical education, because Mater Fornicator just scans so beautifully, he decided to basically take the mickey out of this censorious regime by saying melon farmers. It's a practice still indulged in today in American television, where the version shown on US network television of Snakes on a Plane, which, because Samuel L. Jackson stars in it, 90% of the dialogue is motherfucker. At one point he says, I am sick and tired of these mean frying snakes on this Monday to Friday plane. And believe me, when you experience that being shown on television, it is true comedy. Of course, there are people on the other side who have always felt the law didn't go far enough. Even back then, people like Mary Whitehouse, who of course we'll all remember from such hits as the National Festival of Light, Clean Up TV, and the National Viewers and Listeners Association. I quite like Festival of Light. There was something sort of almost
like
pagan about that. Now, Whitehouse condemned televisual filth. In the 1970s, she referred to one particular TV output as tea time brutality for tots. It contains some of the sickest and most horrific material seen on children's television. Strangulation by hand, by claw, by obscene vegetable matter is the latest gimmick, sufficiently close up so they get the point, and just for a little variety, show the children how to make a Molotov cocktail. She referred, of course, to Doctor Who. How could you think such a thing of lovely Tom Baker? In August 1989, this was a great one, she appeared on BBC Radio, and she was giving a critique of Dennis Potter, the playwright, as a bad man. She confused him with his character that he had written about in The Singing Detective. Claimed that he had committed adultery, or he had seen his mother as a child committing adultery with a strange man, and that the shock of witnessing this had caused her son to be afflicted. And completely thinking she was talking about Dennis Potter, the playwright, and not the character in The Singing Detective. Dennis Potter's mother won a large libel settlement for that. During which Mary Whitehouse claimed that she'd had some kind of an episode and couldn't remember what went on. She died in 2001. 10 years later, HBO launched Game of Thrones, an epic saga of, well, it's just tits and dragons. As Ian McShane said, and he should know, he was in the next season after he said that. Now, on the other side of the line as well, as the melon farmers, there's lots of... Oh, I got to kill. Sorry, I've lost where was I? Oh yes, Nazis. So this image goes back to the Nuremberg trials at the end of World War II. Some of the worst, and I wasn't going to say bastards, but I'm going to say motherfucker later on, and I already have, so sorry YouTube people. Some of the worst bastards who had ever lived were brought up on trial for horrific, unspeakable crimes against humanity that we haven't stopped talking about since. And this was responsible for a huge sea change in Western European jurisprudence. Prior to that, jurisprudence being the philosophy of law, prior to that, the dominant theory of what law was in Western Europe for a long time had been, well, what is law? It's what the state says is the law. That's law. And that, I mean, the stereotype of the Nuremberg defence was we were only obeying orders. But in reality, their defence was the state said it was okay to do these horrific things we did in the death camps. Therefore, because we didn't break the laws of the state under which we lived, we committed no crimes. That, of course, at that point, although this was the purest distillation of positivist theory of law, was rejected. And Western Europe swings hard in the direction of what we used to call natural law, a nice touchy-feelier way of doing it, which posits that above state law there is some kind of higher principle, self-evident in nature, or coming from the divine, if that's your bag, that says, no, look, this is what it should really about and can be used to legitimise law or not. Basically human rights. And from there flows the European Convention on Human Rights, Article 10 of which clearly tells us we have the right to freedom of expression, subject to any such qualifications as may be strictly necessary in a democratic society, clearly set out in law, and for only one of a very narrow set of exemptions, including national which are limited to, there's none beyond these, national security, territorial integrity or public safety. I don't think annexing Canada is included in that. For the prevention of disorder or crime, for the protection of health or morals, for the protection of the reputation or rights of others, so including others' right to a fair trial, right to privacy, and so on. Preventing the disclosure of information received in confidence or maintaining the authority and impartiality of the judiciary. Notably, you may like to be aware that the state, with consistency the record for winning most of the cases against it in Strasbourg, is indeed the United Kingdom. Finally, we get to the Obscene Publications Act 1959. So this comes in the wake of the Convention on Human Rights. This is about sorting our law out, and it is about clarifying the law. That sounds paradoxical, that it's about helping freedom of expression, but by making clear exactly what the exemptions are, we know how close the line we can get. It's a bit like the example I use of my undergraduates is, if I was in a position to make the law and I said, anybody who is standing too close to that door within 10 minutes shall be soundly beaten. Now, we'd get one or two perverts who'd immediately run to the door, but the rest of you who didn't want soundly beaten, well, what are you going to do? Well, you're going to make sure you're not too close to the door, so you'll be hanging out the window. If, however, I paint a red line 2 feet from the door, and I say, unless you're going out for a wee, you don't cross the red line, then suddenly we've got clarity. We can use the full room, we can use the full scope. That is essentially the human rights law concern about making sure that the law is sufficiently clear. And that makes a big difference. We have this new mandated right of freedom of speech. Now, of course, right up until Tony Blair, and his government put through the Human Rights Act 1998, which came into force in 2002. Up until that point, you had to have enough money from somewhere to be able to exhaust your options in courts here and then go to Strasbourg to get a ruling whether your rights had been hit. What the Human Rights Act did was it obliged UK courts to read all law and precedent in a manner which was consistent with the Convention rights. So suddenly you have English courts which are able to say, no, this law is wrong, or we have to vary this law to protect the freedom of expression right. And it makes a big difference in all sorts of areas of law. And generally speaking, even before this, the new legal culture from the Human Rights Convention onwards of being aware of freedom of expression as a thing starts to permeate into the judiciary, and they're a lot more careful about what they let through. Now we'll skip forward to 1980. Some of you are well aware of The Romans in Britain. I can tell who is a connoisseur of the stage. The Romans in Britain is a play. It was written by a guy called Howard Brenton, first premiered at the National Theatre in 1980. And what happens is it opens in ancient Britain. Look, there's a penis. It opens in ancient Britain with the invading Romans, and they grab this sort of little Celtic druid with his little Celtic druid, and they interrogate him because he's one of the Untermensch that they are going for, and eventually some one of these guys rapes him while the other two hold him down. A jolly tale of men of war. Now, then after this happens and the Celt is thrown down, a helicopter lands, obs, as the young people say, and out of the helicopter steps a British sergeant dressed in, for 1980, contemporary military wear, and orders them into the helicopter. And of course it transpires that the whole Romans in Britain is very much a comment on imperialism and the playwright's view that the British Army had been rather naughty occasionally in Ireland. It was a controversial play. It was also prosecuted for obscenity. Now, specifically, the prosecution, it was a private prosecution funded by Mary Whitehouse's people. And this is where it starts to get interesting. Now, the prosecutor was a guy called Geoffrey Robertson, very well known, Australian, I'll not hold that against him, but a very well known barrister, one of the big names nowadays in freedom of expression legislation. He cut his teeth in the Oz trial, which we'll come to in a bit, when he was the work experience boy with the purple velvet suit, so he got sent out to talk to the hippies because he might be able to speak their language. Now, Geoffrey did the thing no barrister should ever do, and he will tell you that's what he did. He asked the question in cross-examination he did not know the answer to. The prosecution case for obscenity largely hung on the fact that Mary Whitehouse, who clearly felt much too sensitive to go and observe this filth for herself, decided she would send a strong, strapping man from her organisation who could probably survive it. And he claimed that he had seen an erect penis on the stage during this rape sequence that took it to a level that was clearly obscene and gratuitous. Now, at this point, this is where Geoffrey asks the question that he shouldn't. And the question you should never ask in cross-examination is one to which you do not already know the answer. Because if it doesn't go your way, that's a hell of a gamble and that can kill your case. However, Geoffrey's instincts are right. Geoffrey produces, which they had acquired previously from the theatre, a seating plan of the National Theatre, and says, and would you mind pointing out to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury, sir, where you were sitting when you observed this erect penis? He was in the cheap seats because Mary Whitehouse's people didn't want to give that filth proper money. At which point the defence pointed out how could he possibly have seen that it was in fact a penis that he observed and not a thumb poked through the robes at crotch level. And the prosecution collapsed, and that was the end of that particular case. So it appears a thumb is not something we can generally consider obscene. However, bubblegum cards can be. These images in the next couple of slides I'm going to show you were ruled to be obscene in a court case in 1967. Now, Clayton, don't panic. These would not be found obscene today. But it shows something very interesting about the test of obscenity. So this was a series of World War II bubblegum cards by an artist called Norman Saunders, produced in 1965. This Death of a Frogman. It says, British frogman Arnold Gray swam subtly towards the German U-boat, and on it goes, and then they get killed by the Nazis, who were bad. They even have a swastika and everything to show that. I don't think U-boats really did have that. Does anybody? I'm sure Scarhart or Kirby could tell us if they were here. But nonetheless, they had all of these, lots of gory deaths. Helpless paratrooper, Train of Death, I like that one. This one's my favourite. Now, the thing about these, and including this one, believe it or not, the court decided that these were not sexual images, but that doesn't matter. In American law, obscenity requires an appeal to the prurient, i.e. sexual interest, which is not the case in English law. So mere violence, as long as it's sufficient to deprave and corrupt its likely audience, can be obscene. Now, the interesting thing about that is that it really, I think, gives us an insight into how flexible this test is to move with the times and with people. Because, for a start, I mean, kids these days have all seen Game of Thrones, I'm sure, so this is not going to bother them. Really, this is not extreme by today's standards. It was only found obscene in 1967 because children were the target market for this, and it was considered too much for children, but adults wouldn't. Amusingly, you can find lots of people selling them on eBay now, and it says banned because I was reminded to go looking for some for my collection of artifacts that I produced to titillate students on a dull Tuesday afternoon, usually in the middle of March. Now, this takes us on a little bit further. Some of the images I am going to produce next are a little bit cheekier. They were at the centre of one of the two most significant obscenity trials in the 20th century, both of which I will talk about tonight. And this was the Crown against Anderson, the Oz magazine trial. If anybody does not want to see a small cartoon bear with a frankly unfeasibly large penis, look away now, I'll tell you when it's safe. I know he's not here tonight, but he'll see this eventually. Titter ye not hard. Well, yes, he's out there somewhere, chortling. So this was the School Kids issue of Oz. You can see the whole thing on the web archive now, the Wayback Machine. Unfortunately, not all of it is fully clear, but there were 3 distinct articles in this particular publication that were considered to be dangerous, and the prosecution was brought over. Number 1 was an advertisement, sadly too blurry to read in the online scan, but an advertisement for a magazine which rejoiced under the title Suck, and described the act of fellatio from the perspective of impliedly a lady performing such an act on the owner of a penis. And that was considered a bit much. Now, so that was one. The second one was a series of drawings of school kids in uniform being quite cheeky with each other, and the third one we'll come to in a minute. Now, this was significant because Oz magazine had been a counterculture magazine. It had been around for 4 or 5 years. It had kind of gone off the boil, and one day the hippies who ran it got a bit stoned and said, "Hey man, what do we do now? What do we do? Because it's all like so square." And they came up with this plan to get a bunch of 15-year-old school kids, because like kids of the future, man, to come in and edit the next issue of the magazine, hence the school kids issue. What could possibly go wrong there? Any of you familiar with music journalism may be interested to know a 15-year-old Charles Shar Murray was one of those kids, although his article was quite innocent. Most of the articles were quite innocent. The top 10 excuses for not having your homework done that are better than but miss the dog at it, that kind of stuff. But these 3 articles were problematic, and the issue was that although younger kids weren't the target audience, that subjective idea, who's the likely audience, they were among the readership. So we end up in court. Now, I want you to bear in mind, before I show you these next couple of slides, a 15-year-old boy was responsible for this. Well, you would have known as a boy. Now, we'll all be familiar with Rupert the Bear from childhood. In case you're not, Rupert Bear was created in 1920, first appeared in print in November that year by an English artist called Mary Turtle. More about her in a minute. And it appeared in the Daily Express. It was originally designed to take sales away from competitors, the Daily Mail, and bizarrely the Daily Mirror, which was considered a competitor of the Express. Nowadays, of course, it would be no competition for them because it doesn't even print one Lady Diana cover a week with a conspiracy theory, let alone 3. Yesterday's was especially good. Apparently it was Prince Philip on the grassy knoll with a sniper rifle. Now, Rupert, of course, became a big part of all our childhoods if we grew up in Britain and Ireland in a certain period. And you'll remember the way the story was told on 3 levels, so that children could engage with the big line at the top that gave you a presse of the whole page, of the grid of sort of usually, I think, 9 pictures in it. Then there were the rhyming couplets below it they could read as they got older, and then of course there was the full text of the story at the bottom. This is what a lot of, not necessarily the 3 different ways, but a picture plus text below it was what all British comics were like originally until they imported the speech bubble from America. And things changed ever since. Now, what this young wag produced was he dug up some Robert Crumb stuff. And Robert Crumb, I'm sure you're aware of, 1960s counterculture artist who had a real thing for drawing weedy little men who looked an awful lot like him, if you've ever seen his picture, and great big strapping ladies with powerful thighs, which was clearly his thing. And I'm not going to kink shame, I like them too, but this is apparently, I've never been able to find any more information about it, but apparently this is an American folk character called Gypsy Granny. So what this little boy did was he took this rather risque comic that Robert Crumb had made, and he cut and pasted Rupert the Bear's head onto it and turned it into a Rupert the Bear story, where what Rupert... Now, I mean, I remember reading about Rupert the Bear when he had adventures and went off to see Santa at the North Pole. This Rupert the Bear finds Gypsy Granny asleep in the woods, discovers she is not wearing any knickers, peeks between her legs, determines she is vulnerable, virginal, and then decides he's going to sort that out without consent or waking her up. Now, this is the image that was really at the centre of the entire obscenity trial. I mean, titter ye not, this was serious stuff. And, I mean, it's, you know, men find it. There are a lot of men in the room looking at this going, yeah, this is about right, it's proportionate. All I'm saying is, ladies, never get a man to measure your curtains, because he thinks that is 12 inches and you'll have window on show at either side. But this ended up in court. So the editors of Oz were prosecuted for obscenity because this was available to children. They lost. But they appealed to the Court of Appeal, and the Court of Appeal found that the articles in question were not obscene, and this is crucial as to keeping the law accurate. The trial judge had informed the members of the jury that they should find it guilty if they considered this content to be repulsive, filthy, loathsome, or lewd, with a W. And the Court of Appeal said, well, that's a misdirection. That's just, that's offensive. Personally, I find what David Beckham earns compared to those of us who actually contribute to society much more offensive. But that neither is considered obscene by the legal meaning. So it is, did it have a tendency to deprave and corrupt its likely audience? And the court said no. The kids who see this will not turn into absolute raving perverts simply as a result of looking at Rupert and his winky. Now, there is a postscript to this. It's entirely self-indulgent, but it is the most joyous email I have ever received from a student, and so I am going to read it now. Dear Mr. Marlowe, she said, I hope you are well. As I did not get the chance to speak to you at graduation, I thought I'd drop you a quick email. Media law is by far the most interesting module I studied. Wanted to thank you for it being entertaining. Highest mark in a law module I've ever received. I'm sure it's because I enjoyed studying it, which was all very lovely. Blew up my ego when I needed it. However, this is the good bit. She continues. Additionally, my great aunt created Rupert Bear. That makes her Mary Turtle's grand niece. I did not know this when I was showing this image in class. I'd have done it anyway. My great aunt created Rupert Bear, so every year my gran tries to coerce me into attending an appallingly dull Rupert Bear convention. I told her about your obscenity lecture and how I can no longer look at Rupert in the same way, and I do not believe I'll ever be invited again. Thus the benefits of your media law course have been endless. I've still got that email in a folder. One day I'll frame it, along with a copy of this picture. Now, then of course we get to the bit that really makes all the difference in the world. This act, and again remember, this is coming in, so we're still using the Hicklin definition of obscenity largely. Now where was the, let's bring that back just a little minute. Yeah, so it is the Hicklin definition. An article shall be deemed to be obscene if the effect, taken as a whole, tend to deprave and corrupt persons likely to read, see, or hear the matter contained in it. Will it deprave and corrupt its likely audience? So that's still the test. But what we also have now, because the Convention on Human Rights is the public good defence. Now this really makes a huge difference. It sounds very middle class, and there's a very paternalistic tone in a lot of English law that way. But if you can justify your publication in the public good, even if it is considered prima facie obscene, if you can show that it is contained in a book or a magazine in the interests of science, literature, art, or learning, or other objects of growing concern, I don't think that was intended to be a euphemism. I think they just didn't spot that one. Films and plays in the interests of drama, opera, ballet, any other art or literature or learning. I did spend a long time one year coming up with a concept for a ballet that could be obscene, which I then wrote into an exam question. Or TV and radio in the interests of drama, opera, ballet, or any other art, science, literature, or learning, or any other objects of general concern. Now, that does sound all very terribly middle class and so on, but essentially the subtext of this is it a dirty book? Yes. But it gets people to read literature when they wouldn't otherwise bother. Oh, well, all right, that outweighs it being a dirty book. That's kind of how this defence works. And of course it was sensationally first applied in relation to dear old Lady Chatterley's Lover. This was first published by D.H. Lawrence. It was his final novel, and it was first published privately in Italy in 1928. Its first English publication in 1932 was this one on the right here. Now, that was heavily censored. And this is the other most significant obscenity trial of the 20th century, alongside Oz Magazine. But it had always been, for 30 odd years, heavily censored any time it was published in England, because nobody dare publish the whole thing. Now, for any of you, I'm guessing a lot of you have read it, But for any of you who hadn't, a quick press with a spoiler alert. It features a lady called Connie. Now, Connie is a young lady in a wealthy, well-to-do family, but she needs a husband. So she meets and marries Lord Chatterley, and hence becomes the titular Lady Chatterley. Lord Chatterley then goes off to the First World War and proceeds to have his legs blown off from under him, returns home, is in a wheelchair, is unable to sire the heir that he as an aristocrat desperately needs for the title and the estate to be passed down. So he intimates to his wife that if she were to go and get, knocked up by somebody else, but discreetly so, they would raise it as his, they'd say nothing more, they'd have an heir, and that would all be fine. So she goes off and she meets this successful Irish playwright who somehow doesn't manage to satisfy her sexually for reasons I could never figure out. I've never had complaints. But then after a while of being a little bit frustrated and saying, really, is that all there is? She meets the gardener, Sean Bean. And they do all the sex. I mean, everything. You name it, they do it. They even do the bum sex. I couldn't find a picture of a bum that was appropriate, but I thought that's a nice ass. Thank you, that's my favourite one. And these have all the rude words, all of them. I mean, you can barely fit in all the fucks between, the fucking, if we can put it that way. And they even use the rudest word of all. Now, I'll not utter it with ladies present, but it begins with a C, and it ends in unt. I know, Kenneth, I know. Now, I defy any of you to honestly tell me this image doesn't flash into your head anytime you hear anything slightly risque. But, so anyhow, what happens is Penguin Books decide, they look at this defence of public good and they think, we can have a go at that. So they publish, they don't publish it yet, but they go and they print up 200,000 copies in their Penguin paperback series. Now this is significant that it's Penguin paperbacks. We come back to that. Oh yes. But they publish these all, they put them in a stack, they have them in the warehouse, and then they take a couple of copies out and they send them to the police. By arrangement, it was basically an arranged prosecution. They go to the police and they say, look, we'd like to publish this. You're going to prosecute us as we do it, aren't you? We're pretty confident we've got this defence. And the police say, well, all right, we'll accept a copy. We're promising nothing. So they give them a copy, and with a lovely little note in their best handwriting that basically says, come and have a go if you think you're hard enough. And the police then proceed to read Lady Chatterley. They give it to the CPS, they read it, and they all decide they are hard enough. I didn't think that through. And so on comes the prosecution. Now, this case ends up with a guy called Mervyn Griffith Jones, very famously led the prosecution case. This was him later in his career when he became a judge. That's the image everybody really remembers of him arriving in court during the Chatterley trial. Interestingly, I wish Sean was here because he could probably date this, but 6 fasting on 1, which I thought for 1960 surprised me. I thought that was quite early, but it appears that unless he has folded that over and it's missing a button or something, just a by the by. Now, this is my favourite photograph of him here. I'd never seen this one until I started researching this particular presentation. He's got this little cheeky cigarette, and he looks a little bit like a cross between Noel Card and a young Neil Kirby there. On the right is Gerald Gardner. Gerald Gardner was the defence counsel acting on behalf of Penguin Books. He later went on to be an Attorney General in Wilson's government from 1964. Now, Griffith Jones, of course, was very much, he was not the sort of genial fellow the defence barrister was. He was very austere, very much a man of his time and class. And very famously, he squarely turned to the jury right when he was beginning to set his case out, and he tucked his thumbs into his waistcoat, and he looked them full in the eye for full effect, and then he said, "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you must ask yourselves, is it a book you would even wish your wife or your servants to read?" There were women on that jury. Maybe he was a lot more progressive than I gave him credit for, asking them about their wives. But now that was made very, very sincerely and clearly expected to have great impact. Everybody in the courtroom collapsed in laughter, and he looked rather crestfallen, history records. But they also failed to attract many particularly experts to their side, and juries in those days clearly appear not to have, had enough of experts yet. And so the defence rallied a lot of experts to their side. Now, they had luminaries like Rebecca West, E.M. Forster, William Hoggart get up and said, well, look, if he says fuck in the book a lot, that just normalises it, so people aren't going to be shocked by it. And lots of people say that word in the real world. I was on my way to court this morning, and a man tripped over in the street and said, fuck, it's just a word. I'm paraphrasing him very slightly, but only very slightly. And, the DPP had approached, for the prosecution, a lot of experts themselves. The vast majority of them dismissed them out of hand, and some of them actually, thus notified of the case, independently approached the defence and offered their services. Not everybody did. Enid Blyton notably declined to appear on behalf of the defence. I don't know whether she was afraid that her status as a children's author would be affected by that, or whether she thought it just wasn't racist enough as a book. I don't know. Now, one star witness for the defence was none other than a man called John Robinson, better at the time known for his professional role as the Bishop of Woolwich. He confirmed under oath his view that it was a book that all Christians should read, and he did get an awful telling off from the Archbishop of Canterbury later on, but he clearly thought it was worth it. Now, the prosecution summed up their case, oh how times have changed, by sneering at so-called experts and appealed instead to the common sense of the jury, and frankly pandered to classism as well. He hadn't learned his lesson about wives and servants, so he said, is that how the girls working in the factory are going to read this book? Probably not in that accent, but you know. Now, the final directions to the jury, Mr. Justice Byrne, the presiding judge, he asked them to consider very carefully the impact of any decision to find not guilty, and the thing he emphasised was how widely the book would be available to, although he didn't quite use the same words, the lower orders. The book would be available for all and sundry to read. You have to think of people with no literary background, with little or no learning, and this was because it was going to be a Penguin paperback, i.e. affordable to the common man. So this is not some fancy limited edition where middle class people who go to the theatre and things, who understand that these are words we don't say in polite society, and you don't talk to people about bum sex and that sort of thing. As we know, of course, the jury unanimously found in favour of the defence, and so the book was published. Penguin rushed their 200,000 copies to all the shops that they could supply the next morning. By the end of that day, this is day one after the trial, all 200,000 copies were gone. Foyles on Charing Cross Road had 300 copies, which they sold inside the first 15 minutes of opening. And during that first day, they went on to take a further 3,000 orders for reprints. So Lawrence was clearly the Taylor Swift of his day. Now, within a year of the trial, they had sold 2 million copies of Lady Chatterley's Lover. Frankly, it's quite a dull book. Yeah. If you want sex and rude words and bum sex and somebody saying the C word, lift any Irvine Welsh novel you fancy. It looks really tame compared to his stuff. But, back then it was quite shocking. But my favourite thing was when Penguin Books did publish a second edition in 1961, it carried a dedication. For having published this book, Penguin Books was prosecuted under the Obscene Publications Act, 1959, at the Old Bailey in London, and the dates. This edition is dedicated to the 12 jurors, 3 women and 9 men, who returned a verdict of not guilty and thus made D.H. Lawrence's last novel available for the first time to the public of the United Kingdom. So I've always thought it was a lovely touch from Penguin Books. Now, as I say, the fact that it was bought by the common people because it was in a very affordable edition was a big thing. And for me, when we look at that seemingly prima facie very middle class idea of, you know, public good, you know, it suggests to me that Lady Chatterley, at least briefly, became popular art rather than proper art, if you like. Now, how many people actually read it, who knows? I know they had fewer TV channels in those days, but still, I bought a copy of Spycatcher in the early 80s, and jinkies, that turned out to be a dull fest. I don't imagine it would have sold anywhere near as well as it would have done if Thatcher hadn't tried to suppress it. There's a lesson there. Now, not everybody, of course, was thrilled it was published. In Edinburgh, where 2-year-old Irvine Welsh lived at the time, copies were burned in the streets. In Wales, women librarians refused to handle it, and the Home Secretary of the day received a letter from an angry mother saying that her teenage daughter was at boarding school and she was terrified that day girls there may introduce this filthy book. Nonetheless, society continued. Of course, the Church Times commented on it, they having entirely ignored the case until they commented on it the day after the conclusion of it. And what they said was, the case of D.H. Chatterley's lover will live in the legal textbooks of England. The decision of the jury that the book is not obscene is one which the 9 men and 3 women were absolutely entitled to reach under the law as Parliament has framed the law. But basically they're going to hell, it goes on to say. Nobody has the right to question the verdict of the jury. Everybody has the duty to consider whether the law under which that verdict was given can commend itself to the Christian conscience. As something of a postscript, this is the actual copy that the judge himself read and annotated, and in 2019 that was put up for sale. It received a foreign bid of £50,000, and it was considered to be so valuable to the culture of the nation that the government issued an order. The arts minister of the time put a hold on the book leaving the UK so that a crowdfunding effort could be taken. It was bought for, I think, £55,000 by Bristol University, where it is on display today. So if you wish to make a pilgrimage, there. Now, the next case we come to was a much more recent case, but 12 years ago, and briefly threatened the very existence of our existing obscenity provision entirely. Certainly blew open a lot of assumed assumptions about what was and wasn't legal, including fisting, which is where you insert a clenched fist into an orifice at the front, on the back, on a lady, on the back, on a gentleman. And this guy is called Michael Peacock. Glorious name. My wife, incidentally, had a university lecturer called Chris Peacock, who never gave his name without a long pause between the two. You got it. But here he is. So this, he also went by the professional name of Sleazy Michael. He was a male escort, but he also had a sideline in selling pornographic DVDs and movies, and in respect of which he was charged with an offence under Section 2 of the Act. He advertised on the internet and on Craigslist that he had certain DVDs available for sale and invited gentlemen who were interested in that sort of thing to inquire of him what kind of titles he had. I think he referred to them as harder material, which again, I'm not sure if that was a euphemism, but no, he sold them from his flat in Brixton. So the recordings at issue in this case featured a number of hardcore gay sexual activities, fisting, as I've mentioned, Eurolagnia, it's basically where they wee on each other, golden showers, Donald Trump knows about that, Oh, we might have to cut that out for libel purposes. I'm sure it's clearly a joke, that'll be fine. BDSM, hard whipping, the insertion of needles and urethral sounding, which always makes undergraduates laugh because I wince every time I say that. When they stick a thing up the hole you wee out through when you're a man, they stick a thing up it. Can't be right. It sounds like it would hurt, but you know, I'm not going to kink shame. People are into that, so fair enough. Have at it, lads. Now, this material, the people buying this asked for that. He didn't advertise the details of exactly that's what it was that he wanted. And very famously in this case, there was a lady got up as a witness for the defence, and researcher in psychology and pornography, who responded to it, and the prosecution said to her, "Would you welcome an anal prolapse?" Now, this was core to it because basically for many years the CPS had assumed if you had fisting in a video, that was automatically obscene. 4 fingers fine. Once you get a thumb in and get a fist in, it can do damage, in theory, if you're not very careful, apparently. And so they basically said, well, that's obscene because it's encouraging people to, you know, pornography doesn't tend to say, look, here's how you prep, be careful, do it right. It just sort of shows people going at it, so to speak. And there was a suggestion that people would be led to think this was easy and damage themselves. That was essentially the thrust of it. No, sorry, I've done that again. That wasn't intentional. Now, this goes up before the court. The interesting thing is the court were very clear that the issue that it was gay was neither here nor there. You know, many years ago, like back in the 50s, when Liberace brought his libel case and convinced the court he wasn't gay and won, despite the fact he was probably, to be fair, the gayest man who ever lived. You know, there was a time when they would automatically have assumed it was obscene if it was gay, but the court was very clear, not an issue this time. The members of the jury did have to watch all of these videos, and it was recorded by those involved in the case. They very quickly looked a bit bored and just not very interested in it because, you know, clearly this wasn't their bag. And they deliberated for several hours on this, but ultimately the jury came out and he was found not guilty on all charges. Now, this caused shockwaves through the CPS because they had prosecuted a number of these acts on the assumption they'd always been considered obscene, not the gender identity or biological sex of the people involved, but the actual activity. And of course, here we are, and the CPS significantly revised in a liberalising way their prosecution policies on this as a result of that case. It's become very significant for that reason. Now, there is, of course, other legislation that deals with this, and this is the way the legal approach is changing somewhat. The dear old Obscene Publications Act is still around, it's still occasionally used, but increasingly what we're getting for the really nastiest stuff and the really nasty stuff, which is stuff that, you know, there's no question it would be obscene. We're seeing possession offences, trying to nip it in the bud, because a lot of it's coming in from abroad where it's impossible for various reasons to enforce that online. And so the strategy has been starve the market for it by basically going after the people who possess it. Now, we're not really talking about an encroachment of freedom of speech here, really. We're talking about animal porn, bestiality, necrophilia, and very serious violence, including depictions